Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to talk today, for us all to hear today, from three experts on the Constitution, on its provision, the Elections Clause, and on the current fight over voting and the shape of democracy in our country. Franita Tolson, Rosemarie Zagarri, and Ron Brownstein. And for those of you who are joining a Brennan Center event for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in our country so they work for all. We're very busy these days. We are very grateful to our partner for this event, New York University's John Brennan Center, which advocates for civil debate in politics and public policy. And before we get started, let me share a few housekeeping notes. First thing, we're going to leave time for questions at the end of the discussion. And if you have questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to add them via YouTube or the Facebook chat. Second, civility is important to all of us at the Brennan Center, really. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. And finally, we do provide live closed captioning. And now to start us off and to provide some context for the conversation, I want to share a video, not of James Madison, but of some more recent political figures.
Just look at one thing. The legislatures of the states did not approve all of the things that were done for those elections. And under the Constitution of the United States, they have to do that.
I want to ask you a specific question. Do you think the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, and in continuing to make that charge, not having states do election reforms, but specifically making this charge that the election was stolen, do you think that that hurts, undermines American democracy?
Well, Chris, I've been very clear from the beginning. If you look at a number of states, they didn't follow their state-passed laws that govern the election for president. That is what the United States Constitution says. They don't say that the states determine what the rules are. They say the state legislatures determine the rules.
But the states all certified.
States, they didn't follow those state legislative.
The states all certified.
Follow those legislative rules. Right, but at the end of the day, are we going to follow what the Constitution says or not? I hope we get back to what the Constitution says, but clearly in a number of states, they didn't follow those legislatively set rules.
So you think the election was stolen?
What I said is there are states that didn't follow their legislatively set rules. That's what the United States Constitution says. And I think there are a lot of people that want us to get back to what the Constitution says we should be doing, not just with elections, with a lot of other things too. And then there are some people that want to just ignore what the Constitution says and do their own thing. You know, that's been a debate that's been going on in this country for a long time.
But
why don't we just get back to the Constitution? We wouldn't have that problem.
And there certainly can happen, but there are people out there. There was a rally for President Trump yesterday, and a number of people said, Joe Biden's not my president, Donald Trump is my president. I guess the question is, do you think the election, last time I promised, do you think the election was stolen or not? I understand you think there were irregularities and things that need to be fixed. Do you think the election was stolen?
Yeah. And it's not just irregular. It's states that did not follow the laws set, which the Constitution says they're supposed to follow. When you see states like Georgia cleaning up some of the mess and people calling that Jim Crow law, that's a flat-out lie. I think most people need to stand up against that sort of thing.
All right.
Yeah, but the law says, again, the legislature passed that law. That's what the Constitution of the United States says, and it wasn't followed in a number of states.
Congressman.
We're going to talk about all of that. And we all know that right now there is a power struggle going on in our country around voting, a great national debate. What many of us think is a fight for the future of constitutional democracy in this country. It has everything to do with the rights of Americans. It has to do with what the Constitution means. It has to do with who has the power and where it resides and what part of government, and how that intertwines and connects to that constitutional charter. Increasingly, as we just heard, it revolves around, and we're hearing more and more about a part of the Constitution that a lot of people didn't know about, that a lot of people weren't familiar with. It's the Elections Clause, and it gives state legislatures, as it says, the responsibility to set the, quote, times, places, and manner of holding elections for the House and the Senate. But the same clause says that it gives Congress the power to make or alter those regulations at any time. And it is a provision of extraordinary, if often latent, power. Nowhere else in the original Constitution is Congress given explicit authority, for example, to alter state law. It is quite unusual in that respect. And at the time of the ratification, it was actually the subject of a lot of debate out in the states. But ever since then, it has been both unknown mostly and uncontroversial relatively for most of the country's 240-year plus history. But now, as we just heard in this video, some politicians in the Republican Party in particular have an interpretation of this clause with a somewhat radical twist that only state legislatures and only the states in which those legislatures sit have the power to regulate elections. You know, unexpectedly, the Elections Clause has become the latest voting rights battleground. And we saw this in the last days of Donald Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election with a blizzard of lawsuits. But unlike bizarre claims about Dominion voting machines or deceased Venezuelan president, these cases at least put forward the patina of constitutional seriousness. As we just saw in this video, we have seen this go from a fringe constitutional theory to a politician's talking point to an intense legal drive in the courts in somewhat record time. So we're going to be asking tonight about this power struggle over the vote and the Constitution. We'll be asking what the Elections Clause is and what it means, what the framers of the Constitution meant, how it's been interpreted over the years. We're going to look at the argument which was front and center in the recent debate over the Freedom to Vote Act, John Lewis Act, in the Senate, that federal legislation on voting right now is a power grab by the federal government, an overreach by the federal government. We'll be asking what the role of the federal government is and the states under this provision. And we're going to look at that newfangled argument that the Constitution empowers state legislatures and only state legislatures to make election law. It's known as the independent state legislature doctrine. We'll ask if it is in fact a doctrine. It hasn't been found by any court, but at least 4 of the current Supreme Court justices seem to think it's a mighty good idea. We're really lucky to have the folks with us today to talk about it. 3 of the leading voices on this provision of the Constitution, but even more broadly on the state of our democracy and how it is being fought over. We'll hear from Franita Tolson. She is the Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and a professor of law at the USC Gould School of Law. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on, among other things, election law and constitutional law and legal history. She's testified before Congress in contentious hearings about this very issue. And she's written about the Elections Clause extensively. She has a forthcoming book, In Congress We Trust, Enforcing Voting Rights from Founding to the Jim Crow Era, and it'll be published next year. Rosemarie Zagarri is a university professor and professor of history at George Mason University, an esteemed historian. She is the author of the book, The Politics of Size, Representation in the United States, 1776 to 1812, looking in a very groundbreaking way at how the battle between big states and small states actually played out and affected the shape of our government. She served as a historical consultant for the project funded by NEH, Mapping Early American Elections. And she's the author of a really interesting and eye-opening book, Revolutionary Backlash, Women and Politics in the Early American Republic, which talks about the fact that in New Jersey, at the very least, and other places, at the very beginning of our country, many women had the right to vote, well before the 19th Amendment. And we will be hearing from Ron Brownstein. Ron is probably known to so many of you through his television commentary and his written journalism. Ron is the senior political analyst at CNN and senior editor at The Atlantic. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and the author of numerous books, including most recently the New York Times bestseller Rock Me on the Water, which is not about the Elections Clause, I don't think, but is in fact about California rock in the 1970s, but also the book The New Civil War, about the divisions in our country, going all the way back to when I first met Ron, and he was the co-author of the New York Times bestselling book, Reagan's Ruling Class. He is one of the most astute and often fierce commentators on what's going on right now with our democracy. And I want to welcome all of you. And I actually would like to start, if I could, with Ron Brownstein to help us understand the moment and help set the stage. You wrote the other day on your CNN column that with help from Manchin and Sinema, Senators Manchin and Sinema, a Republican revolution from below is driving national policy. And this plays into that. What is it that we should understand about what's happening in the fight over these issues right now?
No, first, it's great to be with all of you. Thank you for having me. I do know that the Brennan Center at NYU has chosen 2 Californians to help explain these issues. So a little shout out for that. I think what's happening on voting is obviously extremely significant and extremely ominous in at least 3 different respects. I mean, first, and here, in kind of raising this to the Brennan Center, which is doing such a great job on chronicling and cataloging this, I feel a little like I'm lecturing Picasso on modern art, but I will say that what we're watching is the broadest, probably deepest, most intense effort to roll back voting rights since before the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I mean, the number of states in which this is unfolding is extraordinary. And I do think eventually we will see every state where Republicans have unified control of government, which is 23 of them, doing something, making it harder to vote. It's not over by what passed in 2021. I mean, you saw in Arizona this week, immediately after the vote that their Democratic senator cast to block federal action, Republicans putting forward an entire new raft of proposals to roll back access to the ballot, including ending the state's very successful mail voting system, which I think about 3/4 of people in Arizona use. So this is obviously significant on its own terms. But I think there are 2 other aspects of it that have to be understood. One is that this is not only about consolidating control in states where Republicans now hold the majority. This is not just about who's going to be the governor of Georgia or Texas or Iowa or Arizona or control the state legislature in those states that are passing these laws. This is also about tipping enough states that you tilt the balance of national power, right? In that sense, it is very clearly a revolution from below. I mean, what we are watching, I think, is a broad attempt to use state level power to change the prospects of which party control the national apparatus of government. And the other way in which I think this is extremely significant and ties into that is that what's happening on voting is not happening alone. It is not happening in a vacuum. I mean, you are seeing in red states, I've been covering politics since the early 1980s, and I think what we have seen on culturally tinged and rights-related issues in red states since the beginning of 2021 is as sharp a turn, an ideological turn, as we have seen in over any sustained period, contained period in either direction from the states. I mean, the same states that are passing laws making it harder to vote are also passing laws banning or severely restricting abortion if the Supreme Court gives them the go-ahead. They are passing laws barring transgender athletes from competing in high school sports. They are constricting First Amendment rights on multiple fronts, passing laws, increasing penalties for a public protest that becomes unruly or violent. They are immunizing drivers who run into or run over protesters. They are attacking the First Amendment rights of educators with laws limiting how you can talk about race. There is a whole series of ways in which what I believe is a revolution from below is looking to reverse the rights revolution that we have seen mostly since the 1960s, creating a broader span of nationally guaranteed rights in every state. And I will close with this point. What's really striking about what is unfolding and the breadth at which it's unfolding is that, we are often told that because of all the checks and balances in the American political system, the bias is toward the status quo. The bias is against change. But if you look at what's happening, whether it's on abortion or voting rights or on teaching of race in schools, we are seeing these rights rolled back on a majority vote party line basis in state legislatures. And where the Supreme Court has been involved, particularly in the voting rights area, but potentially in abortion, we are going to see decisions handed down on a party line majority rules basis. But to undo this reversion of rights, to just preserve where we are now, requires civil rights, civil liberties advocates to obtain a bipartisan supermajority of votes in the Senate. I mean, there is a structural imbalance that in a system that's supposedly biased toward the status quo is now making it easier to undo rights than to preserve them. And I think given the polarization in the country, if that imbalance holds, and it will hold as long as the filibuster is there, the direction of policy, I think, is not going to be hard to predict.
That is sobering and gives us a sense of the magnitude of the stakes where this constitutional debate is taking place. It's part of a tectonic or at least a mechanical shift almost in where power is flowing to in our government. Let's bring the elections clause itself in, and I will turn to Franita and to Rosemarie to talk to us about what the Constitution has in mind on this particular thing. Let's take a look at it. I will start with you, Franita. Why is the elections clause in the Constitution? James Madison was quite ardent in insisting that it be in there. What did they have it in mind, and how has it been playing out over the years ever since?
So the elections clause is a very unique provision of our Constitution because in part it was to give states some buy-in into the federal system, right? They get to set the time, places, and manner of federal elections. But at the same time, there was this concern that they would fail to do so. So this is why Congress has the power to make or alter state regulations. That mention of the word state legislature in the elections clause has a parallel in Article 2, where state legislatures are also tasked with appointing electors for presidential elections. Right. So there's this sense that states have buy-in in federal elections, but there is some concern that they will fail to do their job properly. And in fact, Congress has used its power under the elections clause at various points in our history as a way of providing some oversight for state electoral processes. For example, during the Reconstruction era, part of the Reconstruction Project, which was designed to bring the formerly enslaved into the American political system, part of it was based on the elections clause. So the Enforcement Act of 1870 and 1871, which created a system of federal oversight for congressional elections, among other things, it was a very expansive program, was also based in part on the elections clause. And Congress has also used this power in recent decades. For example, the federal law that enfranchises military voters and citizens living overseas is UOCAVA. That was passed pursuant to the elections clause. And what it does is it requires that those individuals receive ballots, and it sets voter qualifications for those voters by basically saying that they are entitled to vote under whatever the state law regime provides. So Congress has used its elections clause authority at various points in our history. The National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act. These are also provisions passed pursuant to the clause, but it just doesn't get a lot of attention because the 14th and 15th Amendments have been really Congress's go-to provisions for trying to protect the right to vote. But they've used the elections clause too.
And I think it's worth sharing with our listeners why Madison was so intent on doing this. If you read the debates on August 9th in the Constitutional Convention, he really wanted this in there, and there was actually an effort to take it out. And he made it quite clear that from his perspective, the purpose of this was because he thought state legislatures, in effect, would be corrupt, would be captured by factions, as they call them, or we would call them political parties, and that they would do things we would now call vote suppression and gerrymandering. They didn't call it that then, as Jailbridge Jerry was standing there, among other things, and the word hadn't been invented. The voting laws were about whether what county seat an election would be held in, but it was very much about the same exact kind of political manipulation that Ron just described that we see. And Rosemarie, why did Madison and other Federalists and other founders care so much about this? How did this play into their vision of representation and who would have a voice in the new government?
Well, remember that one of the most important constitutional reasons that the British colonists in America revolted against Great Britain was because they felt they were not adequately represented. They were not electing representatives to Parliament. They elected representatives to their colonial assemblies. So representation was at the very center of their reason for declaring independence against Great Britain. And Madison and the other framers were greatly concerned that the representation in the states, and especially under this new US Constitution, truly and really reflect the people, the voice of the people, however you want to construe that. And that even though it would be mediated by their representatives, that the representatives would be a kind of mirror to the voice of the people. And they didn't want distortions. They didn't want corruption to interfere with that voice of the people. So, in this new Republican form of government, the people were the government, and representation was at the very heart of that new government.
Talk a little more in depth about one of the big ways this is coming up right now, which we heard over the course of the past month, over the course of the debate in Congress over this national voting legislation. And I want to actually ask you, Franita, you have written a lot about and we heard a little bit about it, about the federal role. We heard over and over again from Senator McConnell and others that this was a power grab. And we're used to thinking of a lot of the election protections that we have as being from the 14th Amendment, from equal protection, so frequently revolving around the protections around race. And you've made the point that actually this clause has a lot of sturdiness to it that has been underappreciated.
Absolutely. It's not constrained in the same way as the 14th and 15th Amendments, where there are some state sovereignty concerns. We saw that in the context of the Shelby County decision, where the Supreme Court struck down a provision of the Voting Rights Act based on the argument that Congress relied on outdated material in reauthorizing the act, in part because the presumption of the court is that states retain sovereignty in this area, and Congress has to have a really good reason for displacing state authority. The elections clause is not so constrained, right? The text itself allows Congress to make or alter state regulations, which means that Congress can change the governing state laws or they can displace them altogether. It's explicit in the text. And so it doesn't generate the same type of federalism / state sovereignty concerns that we see in the context of the 14th and 15th Amendments. But of course, in the context of debates over the Freedom to Vote Act, I think congressional Republicans sort of relied on the state sovereignty argument, regardless of the provisions pursuant to which Congress was trying to pass the Freedom to Vote and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act. So these arguments are tried and true. They've worked in the past, but this is different because not only is Congress relying on the elections clause in the context of trying to pass this legislation, they also relied on the 14th and 15th Amendments, the guarantee clause, which doesn't get a lot of attention, right? So they listed off kind of a laundry list of provisions that could serve as potential authorization for the legislation that they debated last week.
Ron Brownstein, I would like to pull you into this because the argument that this is, hey, isn't this something the states are supposed to do? Don't states run elections? Isn't this one more federal overreach? Has some surface plausibility. I hear it from a lot of people who I think ought to know better. It may have questionable constitutional provenance, but it has political power. How do you see this playing into that power struggle you described?
Well, I do think that one of the core issues we're facing, because of this Supreme Court and its willingness to allow states to diverge on what had been generally assumed to be guaranteed national rights in a steady progression, really since Brown versus Board of Education, but certainly since the 60s, the question is going to arise constantly. What is an acceptable level of divergence among the states on basic I mean, we could be in a situation this summer where suddenly, after 50 years, abortion is functionally illegal in half the states. And that, I think, will become the symbol of this question of how far do we go in allowing states to set their own course? Now, conservatives argue that that is, in effect, a pressure valve release, that if you allow states to set different rules on all sorts of questions, it reflects local majorities and you have less tension than trying to impose a guaranteed national answer. The other side says, I think with more validity, that there are certain rights that should be baseline for all Americans, no matter where you live. And Michael, voting really fits into this, because one of the concerns is that if you can tilt the voting system, and in particular, if you can gerrymander yourself into control of state legislatures almost in perpetuity, which the Supreme Court, in 2019 said that they don't want to get involved in, that the federal court should not be involved in at the congressional level. I assume they would reach the same judgment at the state legislative level. If you can do that and you can change the voting systems in your state, you make it harder for there to be a political response if voters don't like the way that you are rolling back other rights. And so you get into this system where, in a large number of states, the democratic process is kind of constrained and impeded in all sorts of directions that allow minority sentiment to govern. And look, I don't think Democrats or the Biden administration really have done a good job of connecting the dots on what's happening on all of these fronts in red states. But you can see, I think, as I said before, you can see where this is going, and the tension between allowing state divergence and guaranteeing national rights is only going to, I think, intensify, both because of the views of the majority on this Supreme Court, and also because of the sharp turn right we are seeing in so many of the red states under the pressure of the Trump movement.
Rosemarie and Franita, I want to see if you have anything you want to add to that thought, and then I do want to turn to this independent state legislature notion, if not doctrine. Why don't we turn to that? As we described, there's the issue of the flow of power to these very partisan conservative state legislatures. Then there's the idea that because the word legislature is in the provision, that it means only the legislatures get to set these rules. And that means state courts in construing state constitutions might not apply. It means certainly election officials in the states may not have the room to do what they need to do. Query what it means for governors who sign or veto legislation. There was a Supreme Court case about whether ballot initiatives legislating counted as the legislature. It's a rather breathtakingly broad constitutional assertion. And it may well be a major source of litigation or constitutional litigation in the years to come. I want to start, Rosemarie, you have really looked into what was meant by the legislature and what the structures were at the time. Does the Constitution, in fact, give all the power only to legislatures? And what does a legislature mean? Does it mean you have to be a bunch of people in bad suits under a dome, or does it mean something else?
Well, it is a breathtaking misreading of the original meaning, if you want to go that way, of the term legislature as it was used at the time of the framing of the Constitution. Because, first of all, let me just give you a modern day example. When we say Congress passed a law establishing state parks, we obviously are using Congress as a sort of synecdoche or shorthand way of referring to the federal government. I mean, a congressional law can't become law without the president's signature and is subject to judicial review. Okay, well, that's just the common sense understanding. But at the time that the U.S. Constitution was written, the state constitutions were written in the states prior to the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution is built on the experiments in those state constitutions. But as the framers of the Constitution understood it, first of all, they knew that in those states, the legislatures were often the preeminent body in the government in reaction to the tyranny of George III. When in these first state constitutions, the legislatures were the preeminent body, and in many states, the majority of states, in fact, the state legislatures elected the governors, and the governors had no veto. So the notion of separation of powers was in its infancy, was not well understood at this time. And it was a shorthand way for Congress, or excuse me, for the framers of the Constitution to refer to the state governments by referring to the legislatures as the preeminent part of the government. But it's completely misconstruing what constitutional government in the state means if you try and extract the functions of the legislature and say that their functions exist apart from the whole entirety of the constitutional government in that state, that is subject to approval by the governor and subject to the state courts. So it's really breathtaking that they're misreading deliberately, I would say, this text in the Constitution to act as if the legislature on its own has power when it doesn't, and it's totally contrary to the understanding of constitutional government at the time of the framing of the U.S. Constitution.
And Franita Tolson, one of the things that emerged around the time of the Constitutional Convention was the idea of judicial review, and that all these legislatures were under state constitutions, which were newly written, but they had an idea that judges might be involved in interpreting them. How have you seen this play out?
So putting aside the question of whether or not this doctrine is normatively desirable, because I haven't really heard a good argument in the legal scholarship or anywhere else as to why we want to live under a system in which state legislatures are free from the constraints of the documents that create them. I just think that, the idea that state legislatures have the sole responsibility for this is erroneous for many of the reasons that Rosemarie identified, but also more importantly, it's inconsistent with our practice. So a lot of the debate has ignored that in 1911, the 1911 Reapportionment Act, Congress actually said to states, hey, you can use independent commissions to draw legislative districts, congressional districts, if you want to, right? So this is not that this is, something that is unknown to our system. It's just that I think this is another effort to try to empower the states at the expense of the federal government. But honestly, it's doing so in a way that doesn't make much sense to me because state legislatures, part of the reason that, there's a lot of concern, there were a lot of concern about state legislatures at the founding, right? The idea that they are chaotic, they can be undemocratic, they pass laws that conflict with each other, many things that are still true today, by the way. So it's not clear to me why we want to read the Constitution in a way that would empower them with very little oversight from state courts or their state constitutions.
And of course, it's not a coincidence as a political matter that probably the most conservative spot in American government is these state legislatures. And it's in a sense a constitutional theory reverse engineered to give those legislatures power they didn't otherwise previously have. Could you all make clear to the listeners one question that folks have a lot? We're all very focused on the 2020 election, of course. One of the pieces of legislation before the Congress that may be something they look at is the Electoral Count Act, relating to the counting of electoral votes. And the whole system of counting presidential electors, which we all learned a lot about in 2020, that does not only draw its underpinnings from this clause, but from the Electors clause. Are presidential elections different? In other words, do in fact legislatures have more power when it comes to picking a president than when it comes to these other things? I'd ask our professors, and also Ron Brownstein, you certainly covered the Florida recount where this was a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
I do think presidential elections are different. So, one clear textual difference between Article 2 and the Elections Clause is in the context of the Elections Clause, which deals with congressional elections, Congress can make or alter explicitly, right? Whereas Article 2 says that state legislatures are responsible for allocating electors. So that gives them a lot of power. But let's not forget that there are other provisions of the Constitution that are still in force. It's one thing for states to allocate electors. It's another thing for state legislatures to come in after allocating electors by popular election, right? Letting the people vote and then allocating electors based on the popular vote, and then trying to come in after the fact to undermine that vote, right? That was part of the argument in 2020 why the independent state legislature doctrine was gaining so much steam, right? Because it was more so of a express way of trying to overturn the way that electors had been allocated and changing the rules of the game. We saw that a little bit in 2000, right? One of the proposals was that the Florida legislature could just simply allocate their electors to Bush, but after everyone had already cast a ballot. So I don't think that they are empowered to do that. I think that that runs afoul of the 14th Amendment because the election has already been held. But nonetheless, I do still think that state legislatures retain substantial authority in that context.
And the Supreme Court in 2020 actually said again that once the legislature sets the rules, it can't jump back in and say, actually, the voters don't get to say this. But Ron, you covered the 2000 election. How serious was it that if the Supreme Court had not gotten involved, the Florida legislature would have handed it to the governor's brother?
I think they probably would have in the end if they had to. They would have said that there's no way to determine the winner, and therefore we had to step in. And I think that is what you are beginning to hear again for 2024. The idea that you could put enough doubt about the results that the legislature can say there's no way to determine who won, and therefore we have to appoint the electors. I mean, the Arizona bill that was introduced this week would explicitly give them the authority to come in after the fact and overturn the result. Obviously that would be a hugely explosive kind of action. And I do think that, and maybe this will come up in the questions, I think that the assumption from the Trump forces that if they can put in place the mechanism that will allow them to very clearly overturn a decision by the voters in the other direction, that kind of blue America will say, "Oh, well played, you got us, guys," I think is wrong. I mean, I think they are underestimating just how much it would tear apart society, even if it has the imprimatur of the Supreme Court to have an obvious steal of the 2024 election go forward. But clearly, more mechanisms are being put in place to allow that to happen. Part of what we see happening in front of our eyes is the normalization of this idea. Yeah. The normalization, as we heard at the beginning, in Fox News chyrons and talking points from politicians, that this constitutional notion that no court has found yet is in fact right, or that, hey, state legislatures were pressured by Trump and his colleagues to just jump in. How important is it to wage a debate about this issue and this argument, or does even waging the debate normalize it? This is something folks at the Brennan Center think about a lot. I'm interested in what all of you think.
Well, can I just jump in here? I mean, one of the legacies of the revolutionary period, the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, has been that the U.S. system is a system which under which the rule of law prevails. The rule of law, and I think most ordinary citizens don't understand what that means. That means that nobody is above the law, and that that procedures are in place to make sure that the people's liberties are preserved. And I mean, during the revolutionary period, it was arbitrary government that so many colonists were rejecting when they rebelled against Great Britain. But by making up new procedures after the fact to get your candidate into office, I mean, that's arbitrary government. That's the path to despotism. That's exactly what the founding fathers rejected. And I think that it's important for American citizens today to realize that, their rights are in jeopardy, but there's a clear through line from the revolutionary period, the constitutional period, to the present that requires them to pay attention to constitutional principles and to this idea of the rule of law. Since we've never had a coup d'etat effective in the United States, we've taken it for granted. And I don't think we can take the rule of law for granted anymore.
And as we all know more and more, the more we learn, Trump really did try to overthrow American democracy. It was clown-like and chaotic. We think of Rudy Giuliani with the hair dye, trickling down through the flop sweat. But there's no reason to think it will be that way the next time. And in fact, what we're seeing in many respects is a systematic effort to remove a lot of the obstacles to stealing the next election, in the sense that election officials are being removed or targeted. We have these various state laws, and this legal drive perhaps is gaining momentum. So if you look at history in other countries, in other epochs, there is very often the case that the first try it doesn't work out when there's an assault on the republic, but people take notes, and smarter autocrats come into the mix. We've got a bunch of questions. I want to start with the first question, which is, as people look at the possibility that the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court, with its 6-3 supermajority of very conservative justices, will be ruling on this, people start to think about remedies beyond cases, beyond laws. Is it time for there to be a constitutional amendment to protect the right to vote? Or do we already have the right to vote in the Constitution? Franita, do you have a view on this?
Perhaps, maybe I do. It's long past time, right? So in 1966, the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment to protect the right to vote. But the problem is that when the Supreme Court is doing the heavy lifting, basically doing the work that a constitutional amendment would have done, that means later iterations of the Supreme Court can come in and basically gut it. And so that's what we're seeing now, right? We're seeing the current Supreme Court cut back on the protections that the Warren Court accorded to the right to vote. If you have a constitutional amendment that sets a baseline for what the right to vote means in this country, as opposed to just negative prohibitions, right? Our Constitution tells us that people cannot be discriminated on the basis of race in exercising the right to vote, right? That people are entitled to equal protection of the laws, broadly defined. But there's no language in there that affirmatively protects a right to vote. If we had that baseline, then it accords more protection to the right to vote than just relying on the Supreme Court's pronouncements, which can be overturned by a later court.
Ron?
Before the Georgia runoff elections last January, the night before the Georgia runoff elections, Trump went to Valdosta, Georgia, and in front of a virtually all-white audience said, it might have been 2 nights before, he said, "This is our country, and they are trying to take it away from us through rigging and stealing." And that really got to the essence of what I think we are watching, which is that, in a significant portion of the Trump movement, which is now the dominant faction in the Republican Party, there is the belief that they represent, quote, the real America, as Sarah Palin, who has been in the news in New York, famously termed it back in 2008. And by definition, if the real America is outvoted, it has to be illegitimate. Right? I mean, that it is an un-American force of kind of diverse, secular, info age people who, manipulate, write code instead of digging coal. that are running things in the country, and that is inherently illegitimate. And I think everything I think flows from that. I mean, I have said that I view what's happening in the red states on voting as stacking sandbags against a rising tide of demographic change. I mean, you have a coalition that is now controlling these states, that is looking at the way the states are changing and is trying to make it harder for those diverse younger generations to eventually exert power. Same thing, by the way, I think on the way they're trying to control the teaching of race and racism and the history of discrimination in the schools. So if you start with that is kind of where this is going, it's very hard to, it's essentially impossible to imagine there would be enough states to approve a constitutional amendment. So what are the actual tools that you have? The one tool that Democrats and civil rights groups have to push back against this is the same tool they had in the 1960s, which is the capacity to pass federal legislation establishing a new baseline of rights in all of the areas that are under threat, particularly voting rights. And the only way to do that is to given the kind of the state dynamics that we're talking about, is to undo the filibuster. And it is possible. And both of my more learned colleagues on the law can talk about the extent to which this Supreme Court might overturn a new Voting Rights Act or a new Freedom to Vote Act or a new federal legislation codifying Roe, but we will never get to find out without a change in the filibuster, because I do think that is the only lever that is available to push back against this axis of the red states acting on majority rule, the Supreme Court defending them on majority rule, and the filibuster preventing anybody from responding unless you have a bipartisan supermajority.
Well, and the filibuster has been a central issue at other times in American history, always around some bill that was being filibustered, especially around voting rights and civil rights. In 1957, when political alignments were more jumbled than they are today, Richard Nixon, as vice president, the favorite of the NAACP, just like Kamala Harris did, sat in the chair and ruled and worked with the liberal Democrats led by Hubert Humphrey, who he would later defeat for president, to try to undo the filibuster so voting rights and civil rights legislation could pass. And they were outsmarted and blocked by the Democratic leader, Lyndon Johnson, who just a few years later signed and crusaded for the Voting Rights Act. But there have been other times when this arcane procedure has been something that's been a fighting word. Do we think that it's the case that, we're all looking at the recent phenomenon of the big lie of Trump, the fact that 70% of Republican voters think the election was stolen, and the fact that this has become the mobilizing issue for Trump's followers and party. And there are ways in which this just follows and flows from long history in our country of the way race and identity and ethnicity have played out in elections. But there's also something new about it, something we see in other countries where there's backsliding against democracy that is a bit more authoritarian and scary in that way. Are we also seeing now, for the first time, a mobilization for democracy in response to Trump, in response to the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis bill? And this, I've worked on this for a long time. The coalition, the effort pushing for this legislation was unlike anything on voting rights and democracy in probably in half a century. Is this now going to be an electoral issue or a central public debate going forward? I'll ask any of you to judge. We're all experts. We're all experts on this one, or none of us.
I'll give a quick thought, real quick. I don't want to take much time because I would love to hear from both of my colleagues here. But I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I do believe that this fight was a crystallizing turning point moment in the history of the Democratic Party. I believe that Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin will be the last two Democratic senators ever who support maintaining the filibuster, at least for voting rights. I do not think anyone will get elected as a Democrat to the Senate who is not willing to at least carve out voting rights from the filibuster. I think and that Schumer people are asking why push this to a vote when you know you're going to lose. I think it forced everyone in the party to figure out which side are you on. And groups like Emily's List and NARAL came out and said they're not going to support anyone who doesn't make a democracy exemption of the filibuster. It was a crystallizing moment. The broader question is really one of a big debate. And as you may know, among people who study these issues in democratic backsliding around the world, there are 2 points of view. One says that you have to call out the party that is threatening democracy as a threat to democracy. And the other point of view says that there's never going to be a mass audience that really responds to that argument, and that the way to beat quasi-authoritarian parties is through what some people call normal politics of, higher minimum wage and more take-home pay and, more chickens in every pot. I think Biden's instinct was toward the latter, clearly. I mean, he wanted to be a president who was focused on shots in the arms and checks in the pockets and shovels in the ground. He's been pulled into the other fight more than he anticipated. But I think there is no clear consensus on whether the answer to a party moving in a democratically backsliding way is to confront it head on, or to focus on making people's lives better in a way that will make them less susceptible to the lures of such a party.
Rosemarie and Franita, what do you think of this strategic conundrum on how to get people to care about this issue, or whether they should care about it?
I think sorry. No, please, Rosemarie.
I believe in education. I believe that people can learn, but they need to learn about their Constitution, about their government. I'm just afraid that constitutional issues seem too abstract to most people. When voting rights are attached to, voting rights for a particular constituency, it makes sense and it can mobilize people. I think an attack on voting rights in the abstract, which I think that's what it feels like to people, or the filibuster, I don't think, how can I speak for ordinary people? But I just feel like it does not hit people at a gut level where they will mobilize. And I fear that, but I'm afraid that, I think Biden's strategy to go for the more ordinary Joe issues was correct, but, somehow there has to be a countervailing effort to address these issues that are undermining the very substance, the very procedures that guarantee representative government. And I guess I'm kind of pessimistic about that. And I guess, I hate to say it, but I think that people who care about this really do have to pay more attention to their states. I think there has to be more local reporting about state legislatures, because with the demise of the press, of the local presses in so many of these places, people don't know what's going on in their state legislatures. And I think the Democrats have to learn to love the states in a way that they haven't, and they've put their eggs in the federal basket, and I'm just not sure it's going to work for the next, I don't know how many years.
I agree. I agree with much that has been said. In fact, I think that everyday Americans are thinking about inflation and supply shortages and, the grocery store and, paying for groceries and stuff. I think that this plays well with political elites, but the world is not Twitter, right? Like, those of us having conversations about this, we are not the average voter, because these are issues that we deal with every day. But I do think that it is about the narrative, right? So the question is, how do you create a narrative that appeals to the everyday voter to make them realize the importance of voting rights, right? One thing that's powerful is seeing somebody wait in line for 10 hours to vote in Georgia during the primary. That's very powerful. That's probably more powerful than trying to explain to an everyday voter what is in the freedom to vote bill, right? Being able to address that and saying to them, this bill would help with that is a way of conveying that message. Or another powerful narrative would be if someone tries to vote with a student ID in a state that doesn't allow that, right? And you realize that it's a state with a lot of colleges and that affects a fair amount of voters. That's a very concrete way of sort of communicating the problem with some of the voting laws in these states. Those are the types of narratives that work, not things that are technical where you have political elites debating the pros and cons of various issues.
Well, and I think it's also the case that people are far more exercised about something they think they're losing than something that they are trying to gain. At least that has often been the case. And it may well be that as more people get a sense of the threat here, they may get more energized. But you're right that not only is the real world not Twitter, it's not cable television either.
Michael, can I just say one thing? You know,
Yeah.
I just to qualify my own point and to slightly just take this slightly different direction. After January 6th, the connectivity or the flammability of this issue may be greater around Trump personally than it is on the broad issue of voting rights. I think it's very hard. I agree with everyone. It's very hard to kind of generate a mass movement specifically around voting rights. But the idea of Trump personally as a threat to democracy and January 6th as a kind of flash forward of what people can expect if he is given the power of the presidency again, I do think that in the end that will be relevant for at least some voters. Maybe not a massive amount, but I do think it will be a hurdle for Trump with some people who might otherwise have considered him if he runs again.
And I think also that there have been other times in our country's history, maybe not as many recently, where the fight for expanded democratic rights, the fight for democracy, was a mobilizing issue for many people, arguably during the Revolution, the 1820s and 1830s, when the fight to end the property requirement for white men so that working class and poor white men could vote was the issue that organized the Democratic Party. After the Civil War, the fight over the 15th Amendment and voting rights for black men, the progressive era, more, I think, than many of us tend to think, revolved quite a bit around political reform, voting issues, extending the vote for Senate, and of course the 19th Amendment and suffrage. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the Voting Rights Act and what it took to get that passed. So I do think that there are times, maybe not most of the time, when democracy, when voting, when the shape of our government becomes a kitchen table issue. It may perhaps never compete with the price of gas, but it comes in waves. But there are moments where this democratic ferment really becomes what defines the political period. And certainly on the Trump side, we've seen that, and maybe it's happening as a countervailing thing. I want to finish by asking each of you, and I warned you I would be doing this for a very lightning round. What is one thing you would like our listeners to walk away with from this conversation? Start with you, Franita.
So I think it's important for our listeners to understand that democracy is a work in progress. So what that means is that we're always constantly trying to perfect our democracy. And so that means that there will be gains, there'll be periods where there is inclusivity, there is a growing of the electorate, but there'll also be losses, right? We will lose ground, but we have to continue to fight. Because I think in this moment, a lot of people feel discouraged by the things that they're seeing happening in Congress with the failure to pass voting rights legislation and things we're seeing in states with more restrictive legislation being passed, but you have to continue to push back against those things. I know me personally, I run on anger and coffee because I am, laser focused on the fight, and you just have to stay laser focused and not get discouraged, because it's important to understand democracy is a work in progress.
Thank you. Rosemarie?
Well, I just think it's really important that people understand that those who determine the rules of the political game often have a determinative role in the outcome, and that right now there is an assault on the very rules of the game. And I think that it's an undemocratic assault, an assault that is trying to make it possible for the minority to oppress the majority. And I think even though these abstruse constitutional issues don't seem as interesting, they're difficult to comprehend sometimes, I think people, must attend to them. And so, as I tell my students, know your Constitution.
And Ron Brownstein, take us home.
Not much I can add on that, but I would say as urgent as the voting rights issues are, and they are urgent, I think they have to be seen in the broader context of what's happening and the axis of red state legislatures and governors, with air cover provided by the Supreme Court and the Senate filibuster, are engaged, I think, in a project that we are just seeing the opening stages of, to roll back the rights revolution that began really in earnest in the 1960s and return us to a world where your civil liberties and civil rights varied enormously depending on what state you live in. And I do think that it is important to kind of see this in totality and to respond in totality. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge for everyone who believes in kind of expanding the universe and of rights and liberties that are afforded to all Americans.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much to each of you, to Franita Tolson, to Rosemarie Zagarri, to Ron Brownstein. And thank you also to our partner in putting together this event, the John Brennan Center of New York University. I want to thank all of you for listening, for caring. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. And a quick note from the Brennan Center before we leave you: we do encourage you to stay up to date on this great fight for the future of American democracy that we've just been discussing, with the weekly analysis and insight and facts and figures from Brennan Center experts. So please sign up for the briefing newsletter. It comes out on Tuesday. It is nutritious and spam free. It's at the brennancenter.org/briefing. And please be sure to register at brennancenter.org/events so you can learn about future conversations like this. Again, thank you to everybody. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for being part of the work of the Brennan Center. Have a good night.